Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, this is a fun day for me because, long before vlogging through history was created, long before I started doing reaction videos, which I've explained many times was never the original intention of this channel, the OG of history reaction channels was Mr. Terry. And he's still out there doing it, but he's also, you may not know this, got a new channel called Mr. Terry Originals, where he's making original content. And I think it's pretty good stuff. I've watched a couple of them. Didn't watch the one that we're going to take a look at today because I wanted to come at it fresh, as I always do. And this is a video he did about a week ago. It's called What If George Washington Ran for a Third Term? It's alternate his Terry. I like that. That's a pretty cool name. He's got a mix of, he's got alternate history like this one. He's also got some original content telling some stories like World War I in 6 minutes, I think it is, and things like that. So I'll put the link in the description. If you haven't already checked out his original content, definitely check it out. He's only got 1.5K subscribers right now, so let's get that number up and get him some support so he'll keep making that original content. This will be an interesting one. I think I'll have a lot to say about it, but let's go ahead and dive into it and see what he has to say.
George Washington is usually considered one of the greatest presidents in American history, and a lot of that is based on the precedents that he set and how they shaped the office.
That's such a great point, because we have to remember that when Washington came to the presidency, there hadn't been anybody in the constitutional office of the president. And it doesn't exactly spell out in detail the exact role of the president. So he is largely responsible for shaping and setting that precedent that others followed.
The most famous precedents set by Washington is serving just 2 terms. This was rarely challenged before the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which codified the precedent into law. In this alternate history scenario, we'll explore what might have happened if Washington had run for a 3rd term. First thing to acknowledge is that it's somewhat out of character for Washington to do something that resembles an attempt to hold on to power. But in this scenario, we'll assume that Washington's concerns about divisions are so intense that he feels it's necessary to continue to serve, much like how he agreed to be president in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great point, because Washington had to be talked into running for the first term, and then he had to be talked into staying for a second term. And it was one of the few times that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who had both been in Washington's original cabinet, came together, because the one thing they both agreed on in a world of differences that they had was that the country needed George Washington. Washington was seen, remember, the Constitution comes in at a time when there's a lot of division, especially between North and South, as far as what the country should look like, the nature of government. But one thing everybody could agree on was George Washington at the head of it. And so it was the only way they could really give legitimacy to the government.
Some of the bloom was off the rose with Washington, but it's likely that he would not be elected unanimously again, but I suspect that he would still win, and with an overwhelming majority of the electoral vote, and thus clinching a 3rd term.
I agree with everything he just said. George Washington, this is true with anybody, right? I mean, look at most presidents who served 2 terms. Many of them, had they only served 1 term, would probably be remembered much more fondly than they otherwise are. George W. Bush, in recent memory, is a great example of this. Very popular for most of his first term, very unpopular for a good bit of his second term. And a lot of Grover Cleveland, who is another great example of that.
The next thing that needs to be addressed is Washington's death. If things progress as they did in our timeline, Washington would die in the middle of his 3rd term. One question whether that would happen, as he's not retired to Mount Vernon. For the sake of this scenario, I'm going to assume that Washington does indeed still die in 1799, as I think it opens the most interesting possibilities. I say this because the precedent of a president dying in office could be taken to mean that the office is one to try to hold on to. We'll assume that John Adams is still the elected vice president in 1796.
So, interesting thing about this topic is that when a president dies in office for the first time, and in this case it's William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, there's actually some question about the nature of John Tyler's role when he becomes president. Is he actually president? Is he only acting president? And do they need to have a special election after that? A lot of those kinds of questions needed to be answered. And so that's another time when there were some precedents that had to be dealt with because some things weren't exactly spelled out as clearly as they should have been.
One of the first things I want to address about a third Washington term is that I don't see him agreeing to the Alien and Sedition Acts.
No.
Even though Washington has decided to take on a third term, and even though he tended to side with the Federalist faction that ended up on the side of a stronger executive as compared to the Democratic Republicans, I don't think that Washington would have been in favor of such an overreach.
I agree.
As I discussed in this scenario with others before beginning it, one idea that was brought up was that if Washington died in office, it would have tested whether the vice president would have become the actual president or merely acting president until a special election could be held earlier in history than the actual test that happened with John Tyler.
Right. So there's also a question in this case, it probably would have been only an acting president until a special election was held. If something, for example, if Andrew Johnson had been removed from office, which he nearly was, when he was impeached and he was saved by one vote in the Senate. Had he been removed from office, the next in line was the president pro tem of the Senate at that time. And he would have likely only been an acting president, and they might have had a special election then that fall. But again, we don't know for sure, because maybe had that happened, they would have determined the same way they did, which is that no, the vice president would have became president. Same thing would have happened in pro tem. I don't know.
However, would not be the case. There's the possibility that Adams filling out the term would answer the question by default, but I have a feeling that it would have taken another scenario in which a special election was an actual possibility to make that final decision. I don't think that we'd see any major variances from the early Adams presidency would have taken place besides the lack of the Alien and Sedition Acts. There would still be the XYZ affair, and the weight that it held on the Adams presidency would be shifted to the Washington presidency. Despite that, however, I don't see any long-term drag on Washington's reputation because the fact that he died in office would help to mythologize him.
That's actually a great point. We do tend to mythologize presidents because of the what-if factor, right? We love to talk about Garfield and how he could have been one of the all-time greats. He also might not have been had he lived. We don't know. But because he died, we tend to think that. JFK, same thing. He's mythologized and probably ranked higher than he otherwise might have been if he had had another full term and had to deal with the Vietnam issue and had a lot of the stain of Vietnam attached to him rather than it was to LBJ.
Much in the way that it martyred presidents like Lincoln and Kennedy so that they're untouchable to some. But if there was any change of note, it would be that Washington would be even more closely identified with the Federalist faction.
Yeah.
Though with the modern view of that, I'm not sure how significant a closer bond would have been.
I'm curious, too, because remember, by the time Washington's in his second term, he doesn't have Alexander Hamilton in the cabinet anymore, for example, and Hamilton had been a big influence on him as far as the federalism goes. But there is also the factor of creating a standing army during Adams' administration. And one of the ways that they got away with convincing Adams and convincing the country they could do a standing army was that Washington, who by this point was the former president, agreed to be the head of the army, and they made Hamilton his second in command.
Again, I don't see any significant difference with the Adams presidency, even though it would have been shorter. I think that the XYZ affair and the Quasi-War would carry over onto his watch, and I could see something along the lines of the Alien and Sedition Acts being passed that happened early in Adams' presidency in our timeline. The mourning over the loss of Washington would mean that the flaws of the third presidential term would be blamed on Adams, and he would lose the 1800 election to Thomas Jefferson, much like in our timeline. The Jefferson presidency is where I think things could get interesting. I see no reason to think that we don't have the tie in the Electoral College that leads to the 12th Amendment, fixing one of the major flaws of the original Constitution. But little having really changed from our real-life timeline, Jefferson would still be seen as the more palatable option over Aaron Burr, and Jefferson and Burr would become president and vice president respectively. I see no reason to make any significant changes to the Jefferson presidency. Ultimately, we have to change very little up to this point beyond the fact that we have Washington serving most of the third presidential term. And
yeah, so I think so far with what he said, I think the most likely significant change to our timeline with a third term for Washington would be if Washington survived and didn't in fact die in the middle of his term, and therefore the election of 1800 then becomes when we have Adams versus Jefferson, and at that point Adams isn't tainted by things like the Alien and Sedition Acts and the way that he deals with some of those things, and maybe then we don't end up with a Jefferson presidency the same way that we did. Maybe that'll be what he gets into. I don't know.
Some of Adams' more controversial actions happening later as a result. Things like the Louisiana Purchase still happen. The Embargo Act still happens. This latter incident weakens Jefferson, and with his philosophy that a president should not serve too long as to not become too powerful, he chooses not to seek re-election. For example, he once advocated for a 7-year term for presidents, after which they would be ineligible to ever serve in office again.
I could see a scenario, though, where if Washington sets the precedent of a third term, then other presidents feel much more free to do the same thing because of how Washington is viewed.
He later decided that 7 years was too long for a term. 8 years in the presidency is as close to his initial idea as one could get with 4-year terms, and as such, I see Jefferson becoming the first president to willingly give up the presidency. James Madison then is faced with a choice. We have the 8 years that he served, and I believe they play out the same way that his 8 years did in our timeline. I don't think that Jefferson's decision in his alternate timeline would have had the same power in setting a precedent that George Washington's did in our timeline. And I think that Madison would have pursued a third term. He would have faced the same disorganized Federalist Party that James Monroe did in real life and would have cruised to a third term. By the end of this third term, he would have been days away from turning 70, so I don't see him running for a fourth term.
Yeah, I mean, this is a time when basically you don't really have an opposition party to speak of. John Adams is really the only Federalist president there is, and he's kind of discredited, and they call this the era of good feelings because you have this back-to-back-to-back two-term presidencies with Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all from the same party and really with no strong opposition.
Likewise, James Monroe would have been 70 after 2 terms from 1821 to 1829, and I think that he would have stepped down. If anything, this might have made 70 something of a default retirement age until the right person challenged it. The right person might have been the next man in the office. I think the populist Andrew Jackson would still have been in a good position to defeat John Quincy Adams in 1828, even without the latter having been president himself. With all but 2 states having transitioned to a popular vote to make their choice for president that year, a man seen as the man of the people would fare way better than he would have had a chance in previous years.
I would say this, though, to push back against that a little bit, and I'm not saying he's wrong at all. To push back, if you have that long of a time where it's one-party domination, especially if you have presidents who run for more than 2 terms and are seen as maybe overstaying their welcome a little bit, I can see a scenario where there might be more of a populist view toward picking someone from the opposite side, like John Quincy Adams, especially somebody like John Quincy Adams is. John Quincy Adams is the son of a founding father. He's a very qualified, one of the most qualified candidates for president we've ever had. So I could see a scenario where Adams still wins that and maybe even wins the popular vote.
Jackson's popularity was high in 1836, and he runs for a 3rd term. The issue of Texas plays a significant role in his decision to do so. As in our timeline, he delays announcing his plans for Texas until after the election. But early in his 3rd term, he makes it clear that he wants to annex Texas, leading to an earlier war with Mexico. This war looks very little different from the Mexican-American War in our timeline, as American troops would relatively quickly cut through the Mexican forces and would be able to force major concessions. If we assume that the war goes on about as quickly as it did in our timeline, and it may have been shorter in the aftermath of the war between Texas and Mexico, then even at the least...
Yeah, I think if the Mexican-American War happens closer in history to the Texas War for Independence, you do find an easier situation for the United States. You've got a decade in between the two of them.
We see Texas become a state by 1838, but more likely in early 1837. This is where Henry Clay comes in.
I was going to say, what does this do to the whole balance of free and slave state? Because Texas being admitted to the Union was one of those dominoes that falls, where you've got another slave state being admitted, and you've got all this balancing and compromising going on to keep that slave state versus free state thing going.
Knack for compromise would have been key to not seeing the country torn apart by civil war at least 20 years ahead of the timeline that we know. With the massive size of Texas, there would likely have still been a provision that allowed for the region to be split up into multiple states, and with the agreement that was finally made on the borders of the state of Texas, all of these states would have been eligible to have slavery within their borders, and that would greatly upset the north-south balance of the country.
It would never
have
happen.
been a dispute over the future status of the
There's no way that multiple states made out of Texas would have been admitted to the Union, because of how many senators would have come with that from slave states. You would have had to have admitted multiple states in the North as well.
Territories acquired from Mexico as well, since the Missouri Compromise applied only to the territory acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. As a result, we're likely looking at a compromise of 1840 rather than 1850, and Clay would be at the heart of it again. Speaking of 1840, Jackson has a decision to make that year. He has to decide whether to try and stay in office or hand it off to someone else. At the age of 73, and that age starting to catch up to him, I believe he would step aside in favor of Martin Van Buren. Additionally, Van Buren would not be saddled with the Panic of 1837, as the annexation of Texas and further expansion and war with Mexico would have at least lessened the effects of the Depression. Van Buren wins, and the Whig Party is thrown into chaos. As such, by the time 1844 comes around, I believe that the race that the Democratic Party nomination will, for all intents and purposes, become the race for the presidency. I don't think the winner will be unopposed, as the Whigs will still run a candidate, but it will look something similar to the end of the Federalist Party, where the party is dysfunctional and disorganized and puts up little resistance.
So then, do we see the advent of the Republican Party sooner? Is that where we're going with this? Because, I mean, the advent of the Republican Party is what is born out of the death of the Whig Party and out of a frustration with the direction the country's going as far as the slavery issue goes, and it's a direct result of things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which I'm sure he's going to get into.
One thing that we've had to put a good bit of thought into is, with the question of the Texas issue off the table, does Jackson still find himself disappointed in Van Buren and support Polk? Ultimately, though, I think the sectional differences would be taking a big enough spotlight that the Southern Jackson would find something he disliked about the Northern Van Buren.
Right, because Van Buren's from New York. Polk is the other Nashville president, right? They're buried within a couple miles of each other in the Nashville area. So, yeah, I think just inherently Jackson's going to lean more towards a guy like Polk.
And throw his weight behind the Southern Polk, as he did in our timeline in 1844. Polk again defeats Van Buren, and he is a shoo-in for the presidency. Perhaps the thing that the Polk presidency is most remembered for is the Texas issue.
Yeah.
But that has already been settled. As a result, I think he turns his attention to another expansionist issue, Oregon. The slogan 54-40 or fight becomes real, and the U.S. fights the British for all the Oregon territory.
We don't talk about this enough. The threat of a third war between the U.S. and the British was very real all throughout the 19th century, at least through and including during the American Civil War and in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War. We often look back and think of the British in terms of the special relationship we have today, but that was really only forged once you get into World War I. So, and another thing, obviously, that we can't really account for in all of this is that in this time period, the 1840s, 1850s, there's some real problems with health in Washington, D.C. because of the water supply and things like that. That's why we have presidents dying. We have, William Henry Harrison dies, and we have Polk dying immediately after he leaves office, and you have other people in positions of power there dying around that time. Zachary Taylor dies in office. So some of these presidents might have died in office in this timeline that didn't otherwise.
In reality, he institutes the gag rule as well, and this, coupled with the need for a new opposition party with the fall of the Whigs, will help lead to the earlier creation of the Republican Party.
I can see that.
And of course, the Wilmot Proviso is going to pour fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
I'll leave to the imagination of you, the viewer, to exactly what the final powder keg that sets off the slavery issue is. But I feel that it happens during the Polk presidency, since everything's been accelerated. Polk would be himself in this scenario and stick to only one term. I'm actually not going to take a guess at who the Democratic nominee will be for president, because I don't think it will matter. Much like 1860 in our timeline, we see a north-south split in the party, and even if there is a single candidate, the party will be fractured enough that the road will be wide open for a southern third party, dooming the Democrats to defeat William Seward and the New Republicans. If the election of Lincoln, who merely opposed the expansion of slavery, triggered secession, then certainly the election of the more radical Seward would have this effect, and we'd see the nation divided and plunged into war 12 years earlier. At this point, we'll stop looking at the changes that spawn off from the divergence point and look at the scenario from another perspective. Which later presidents from our timeline would have run for or been elected to third terms if there were no precedent set?
Yeah.
As we go forward,
I think that basis for the whole thing is a great starting point that he went with, because just the simple act of Washington not setting a two-term precedent and going for a third term completely upends everything we know about the presidency, because all kinds of bets are off at that point. Because anytime you see, at least in the 19th century, a president flirt with the idea of a third term, it's even somebody who's a fairly popular president can't even win their own nomination. Grant is a great example of this. Grant serves 2 terms, takes a term off, and then comes back in 1880 and runs for the Republican nomination and doesn't get it. He can't even get his party's nomination, as popular as he was, because there was just so much opposition to that idea of a third term. And yeah, so I mean, who knows where it goes if Washington serves a third term.
Assume that any two-term president not mentioned is expected to retire after 2 terms, whether because of health or philosophy or unpopularity. Interestingly enough, we have to go no further than Ulysses S. Grant to find our first. Again, I want to remind you that we have diverged from our alternate history timeline. Because, for example, the Civil War happening 12 years earlier completely changes the political history of Grant.
Well, yeah, Grant's not even somebody anyone ever hears of if it happens 12 years sooner.
I think that there's little question that Grant would have run for a third term. In our timeline, after taking 4 years off, he sought the Republican nomination again in 1880, which, had he been chosen, would have seen him running for a third term.
Take a drink, everybody, if you play the VTH drinking game. I just mentioned something that he talked about after.
Though not consecutive. In this scenario, he attempts to hold on to the job in 1876. He has more success than his attempted third run in real life, as I think he would have managed to hold on to the nomination. But the disputed 1876 election comes out differently. With the Republican nominee saddled with corruption in his administration, the Democrats are able to rise to the challenge, and we will see Samuel Tilden elected president.
So the only disagreement I would have with him on this is just the idea that even a guy like Grant becomes president in the first place. Grant was, like a lot of great people, a product not only of his own abilities and his own personality, but also the time and circumstance. And if you back everything out by 12 years, and you've got a Grant that is much younger and is still in the military, like a lot of other guys are, but is actively in the military while being an alcoholic at that time, and he ended up having to resign from the Army as a captain because of his alcoholism. So would that have happened the same way? It's hard to say.
One president I confess to being unsure about here is Grover Cleveland. There was a faction that wanted to see him pursue a third term in 1896, though he declined. Would that be different without the precedent set by Washington? I'll leave that to you to decide. Teddy Roosevelt is another president who ran for a third term in real life, and in this scenario, I don't see him turning over the reins to Taft as he did in our timeline. I don't see him considering a third term for risk of dictatorship in this timeline, as it had been done on several occasions. Rather, he runs for a third consecutive term and wins easily.
And remember that first term had actually been McKinley's term, but Roosevelt became president a few months into that term.
This timeline, the US gets involved in World War I earlier, speeding up the end of the war. And in what could have been an alternate history, one could wonder if this is enough to save the Russian Empire. But Roosevelt would be riding a high of popularity.
Fair enough.
If he chose to run for a fourth term in 1916, I think he wins. In fact, if he were president instead of traveling, he probably would not have had some sort of health problems that he had later in his life.
Yeah, this is a great point, and a lot of people point to like a similar story with Washington, where Washington died during what would have been his third term in real life, and Roosevelt died in 1919. during what would have been his presidency had he lived. And the question, of course, is would he have died? Because he goes on this Amazon expedition. He nearly dies in the Amazon, and that causes health problems that eventually catch up with him, and he dies a few months after his son is killed in World War I.
Before his death in 1919, he was speculated as a candidate for 1920.
Yeah.
He would have been just 62.
He wasn't that old, yeah.
What would such
Remember, Theodore Roosevelt is the youngest man ever elected president, or to ever become president. Kennedy was the youngest elected, but Roosevelt was younger when he became president after McKinley died in office. He was only 42 when he became president.
popular president have seen his time in office finally end? Who knows? It's a little known fact that Woodrow Wilson wanted a third term. He hoped that the Democratic Convention would deadlock in 1920 and
Dude, you were barely hanging on to life. And of course, here's another one who died during what would have been his third term if he had served.
decided to stick with him. That said, one could ask, would it be a third term for Woodrow
Or his wife?
a first term for Edith? Yeah, I said it. Obviously, FDR runs for a third term since he did in real life. Obviously, he runs for a fourth term since he did in real life.
But I don't know if FDR would have had the political capital to do that had it not been for the circumstances in the world at that time.
Might be different is that after the fact, no attention might have been paid to that fourth term. First, it's possible Teddy would have had a fourth term, so it might not be unprecedented. Secondly, with third terms having already been a thing and the country being at war in 1944, the fourth term might have seemed natural.
Or in the aftermath of Theodore Roosevelt having a fourth term, maybe we pass a constitutional amendment that much sooner to outlaw it.
Despite his failing health. That brings up the question of whether the 22nd Amendment would become a thing.
There you go.
We'll address that later. The next president I see potentially running for a third term is Bill Clinton. It's a very interesting question as to whether he could have won a third term, since the election of 2000 was so close in our timeline. But I think Clinton...
But the election was close between Gore and Bush. It wasn't Clinton versus Bush.
would have had a few advantages that Gore didn't have. One is incumbency, another's charisma, and the third is that the worst things that the opposition could have brought out against him would have already been out in the open.
True.
If he proved to be made of Teflon before that, which I think the midterm elections of 1998 might have demonstrated, then nothing would stick to him in the election of 2000. However,
and again, he's a pretty young guy. Unlike some presidents, he didn't necessarily have a disastrous second term.
Despite my trying to figure out what might have happened with Teddy Roosevelt, I won't do so with Clinton. There's one reason for this. September 11th, 2001. Clinton's response to 9/11 would almost entirely dictate whether or not he'd be in a position to run for a fourth term. Though I'll say that I think he would have done so if he were in a strong enough position. Next, we have Barack Obama. I can't see a scenario in which Obama doesn't run for a third term if eligible. I won't speculate on whether or not he would have won for two reasons. First, I think that making such a declaration would be too divisive and would detract from the focus of this scenario. Secondly, I just think it's too murky. The 2006
I think it's all murky. I think you get that far from your original diverging point, and you have no idea. The whole ripple effect would mean that all of the candidates and all the presidents probably would have been different. So I understand that he's just kind of applying the third term principle rather than completely changing history, but there's no point in speculating too much about a third and fourth term for some of these people who might not have ever been president in our timeline.
2016 election was close, and Obama would have been a stronger candidate than Hillary Clinton, in my opinion.
Yeah.
However, there was a strong anti-incumbent, anti-Washington sentiment that bolstered Trump in the Republican primaries. If I were going to make a call, there are strong reasons for going either way. Finally, let's close this theory by asking the question about the 22nd Amendment. If such an amendment passed in this scenario, it wouldn't be in response to FDR, as already discussed. The one time I can see a possibility in something like this being triggered would be during the Teddy Roosevelt presidency. There, we have to make a few assumptions. One is that he remains popular enough to be continually elected.
And that's the thing. The longer you're in office, the less popular you're going to become. It's just people just get tired of you after a while.
We have to assume that he doesn't die in 1919. Third, we have to assume that there does not come a point, probably within 4 terms, that he does not decide that enough is enough. That said, I can see an extreme scenario in which Roosevelt tries to hold on to power where he runs for term after term without giving up power, that there becomes a concern about one man holding too much power. If that happens, then I can see a term limit for presidents being enacted, though I think it would be more than 2 terms. It would likely be 3, possibly even 4 terms.
Probably 3.
If it's 3, then that changes 1944 because FDR is ineligible. However, I think that if Teddy Roosevelt steps down or dies before a 3rd term, which seems very likely, that there would be little more than murmuring about such limits. I don't see anyone managing to surpass 4 terms in the
until somebody violates the Washington precedent, there's no reason to codify it into law.
Meantime, as such, I think that the odds are that, to this day, if George Washington had run for a 3rd term, that there would be no term limits on U.S. presidents.
All right, that was good. I enjoyed that. Love seeing some original content from Mr. Terry, and like I said, he's the OG of history reaction content. There is no vlogging through history as you know it without him. So click on the link and check out his original content, and let me know in the comment section what you agree with, what you disagree with, whether with what he said or what I said. Let's have a conversation. Thanks for watching.